Episode 38 of Stand Up asks the question, how about that impeachment, huh? Hey, everybody. Hi. Hello, friends. It's me. Feeling good. Feeling pretty good. Thank you very much for tuning in to Stand Up. Thanks for telling your friends about it. Thank you to all of you who are paying on Patreon. Over 300 subscribers paying for this podcast, and I couldn't do it without you. Can't sustain it without the paid subscriptions. And it's growing, and it's getting better, and I'm getting better and feeling better about my life. Thank you so much for all the great advice and commiseration and empathy. We've created an awesome community at SiriusXM with Stand Up. Brought so many of you over here on the podcast, added so many new people, and we're rebuilding. I'm rebuilding. Thank you for your faith and your support and your kindness and your generosity. This is the classroom of life called Stand Up with Pete Dominic. Every show, I'm going to do my best to fight apathy and ignorance and learn together with you from my expert guests and other awesome, smart, entertaining, thoughtful people about the issues and ideas that matter to you, to your family, your community, your country, your planet, your own personal well-being. We're going to help each other out. We're going to support each other on the roller coaster we call life. And I thought, I'm always torn about doing daily news and analysis because there's so much of that out there, so much good daily news and analysis about relevant issues. The podcast is for the deeper, longer-term impact issues, helping us figure out how to solve these problems. But I'm so obsessed with the impeachment. Are you paying attention? I am. It's impeachment, for God's sake. The President of the United States has been impeached by the House, and now the Senate is having a trial. And so I thought, I got to talk about it, but only if I can get Eric Segall and Laura Coates to join me. And you know what? Son of a gun, I did it. I got them both. Coming up, Eric Segall from Georgia State University will join me. But before then, we've got Laura Coates. Laura Coates, of course, went to Princeton University. She worked at the Department of Justice. She is the host of her own show on SiriusXM's Urban View every day, 10 to noon. And you can see her on CNN every day as well, where she's a legal contributor. And if they don't give her own show pretty soon, that means they are not good at knowing what people want. Laura Coates is one of the best. She's one of the most intelligent legal analysts in all of the biz. And she's one of my best friends. I love her. Follow her at The Laura Coates. Listen to her on SiriusXM. Watch her on CNN. And now listen as she was able to escape from the panel. She was on the panel at SiriusXM during the impeachment, doing analysis, and they gave her a break, and she took a 20-minute bathroom break to talk to me. Thank you, Laura Coates. Here's our conversation right now on Stand Up. Okay, so we are talking, Laura, on, what day is it? Thursday in the afternoon. So there's a bit of a break, and you ran off the set, and you called me, and I really, really appreciate it because I know you're crazy busy. But up until today, could you say that anybody in the public has changed their minds about anything, much less Republican senators?
It's a good question, Pete, but here's how I'm framing this in my mind. The real answer to that question depends on how much information people had initially. And think about it. For myself, I have been a devoted watcher. I have been watching from the beginning, not just this impeachment trial, but the impeachment inquiry. Prior to that, the Mueller probe. I mean, all of this has been really cumulative in a lot of ways. And so I was watching when Dr. Fiona Hill testified. I was watching when Ambassador Gordon Sondland or Bill Taylor was testifying, or Alexander Vindman. And so you have this accumulation. And so if you've been watching all along, you probably have formed an opinion and you've come to some conclusion. That's why you had so many candidates on the trail voicing their opinion about what they thought should happen. But here's the problem. For the vast majority of Americans, and probably across the globe, they're just checking in. They've got competing priorities. Things are this is certainly important to them, but they kind of thought, you know what, I'll check in when it's time. It's kind of like when you hear about the Oscars and you get the nominations and then you decide what movies to go back and prioritize. That's where we are right now. So for a lot of people, they're finding out about it for the first time. They're going, oh, is that what Dr. Hill was talking about? Is that where she fits in? This is how you connect the dots. And for those people, those members of the public, that's who I think is having the epiphany. I think members of the Senate, too, though, Pete, also weren't watching. They were doing it. In fact, for one of the witnesses, Jennifer Williams, I believe, senators said, well, they were in some other engagements and they could not watch her testimony, so that they were precluded from even watching that if they wanted to. And so for some of them, they're learning for the first time what are the Oscar nominees, what they should be watching, who are the big witnesses, and how it all fits together.
So the House managers are laying out the case. They're using video. Everybody's giving them rave reviews and so on. But the bottom line is it's kind of they're laying out the evidence. But what it seems like is happening is that Republican senators have been voting against all of these proposals, these amendments to see documents, texts, emails. And of course, we haven't had the vote on witnesses, but they're voting against seeing the evidence that Democrats want to see and want to provide to create more transparency to build their case. Is that right? They're voting against seeing evidence?
Yeah. And that's how backwards it is. I mean, even trying to articulate the question, you find yourself going, that can't be right. That can't be right. But it is right. What they're doing, well, it's not right as in it's correct, your recitation, but it's not the appropriate thing to do. They're essentially saying, all right, verdict first, trial next. And where does that possibly work? How could that go over? And of course, here's the breakdown, right? You got 24 hours per side over a 3-day period. So each side, the defense and the House impeachment managers have those 24-hour days. 3 8-hour days. Then you've got 16 hours of questioning. Then you've got to vote to figure out whether you want to see more documents and subpoena and also talk to witnesses. So essentially, by the time all of that is concluded, what time has been reserved to ask questions about things you may want to reference? I mean, imagine, if you will, someone saying to you, you know what? I'd like you to ask me any question you want. I'm a total open book. You can ask me about anything about my past, anything about my love life, anything about my sex life, anything about my schooling. I'm just not going to tell you any information about it, but you can feel free to try to figure a question out. And here's the thing. You won't get to do it for another week. So the issue here is like, how useful can that possibly be? But it's also speaks to a larger issue here, which is, what's the point of this? And what's the calculus of, say, a Mitch McConnell or the Republicans? Yeah. Mitch McConnell, his game is twofold. Number one, he is apparently seeking to protect the president. And on the other hand, he's trying to protect the vulnerable Republican senators who need to at least create the impression that it's a transparent and a fair trial. And so in order to satisfy that first goal of protecting Trump, you have to limit the witnesses who, frankly, through the narratives that have already been given through Schiff and through Val Demings and Hakeem Jeffries and Jerry Nadler and the list goes on. The House managers, through all these people, it doesn't seem to be very favorable because it's all there in some documentation and also in the testimony they've given. And so now they want to protect Trump, but in doing so, they're going to have to figure out a way for these, maybe not wavering senators, but ones who actually could go the other side, and also those who are vulnerable in their coming re-elections. How do you make sure they can save face and say, you know what, we tried. We're not going to prove their case for them by having them us bringing in the documents and whatnot, which I think is really kind of a sham argument. Yeah, because they don't have to, Pete. They never have to go to the judiciary to initiate impeachment inquiries or to exercise their right as the House. The Constitution granted that. This is really just kind of one of those arguments that sounds right to people. Why didn't you go to the judiciary if you're just checking in occasionally and not realizing that they have subpoenaed people? They did endeavor to do this. That's why you have an obstruction of Congress charge, because they provided nothing. That's one of the two charges, impeachment of articles of impeachment, the obstruction of Congress. Are they calling you back yet? You got time for one more, two more? Yeah. Okay. So for you, Pete, time. I don't know. Until, of course, I don't have. What is it like, by the way, when you're on the set? Take us behind the scenes. You're on the set at CNN, and you guys all sit there and you wait for there to be a break to go on and analyze it? Yeah, you are watching either from on set. Some people are in studios, or they're called flash studios, where you are because there's not enough room on the set, or you're in different locations across from between DC to New York and other places, Atlanta perhaps, and you're weighing in, you're watching. I mean, literally on bated breath, what's going to happen next? What's the plan? It's unfolding before us, and we're talking amongst ourselves at some points to try to make comments and respond to things, even off camera, to pose questions or ask rhetorical ones of how can this be happening, or why haven't they raised this point? And it's funny how often the very questions we seem to have are the very ones that the members then will go to, perhaps, or the next day after listening to commentary, et cetera, across, I'm sure, all networks, they start to massage their case, because remember, we are watching alongside the audience, just with a different perspective of prosecutorial experience or impeachment experience or political backgrounds, and having lived through this before, and comparing and contrasting. And so it's a very interesting time. It's fascinating to be on set with all of between John Dean to David Axelrod to Jeffrey Toobin to members of Congress to George Conway was on set on Wednesday opining about his views and what was happening. And you really run the gamut. People who come from different ideological corners have one thing in common, it seems. And the one thing they have in common is we are a bit dumbfounded. I don't want to speak for anybody else, but a bit dumbfounded at the notion that there is no solidarity in Congress. And what I mean by that is not just between Republicans and Democrats, but between the two chambers. Congress is supposed to be this umbrella term, Pete, for obviously the House of Representatives and the Senate. But I keep going back to that notion of Michael Corleone telling, his brother Fredo, look, never go against the family. Well, Trump has gone against the family in the sense of he has thumbed his nose at a congressional subpoena, not a House representative subpoena given by the majority Democrats who are in power. No, he has basically said, yeah, here's your constitutional oversight. That and a bag of rocks will get you nowhere. And there's no solidarity to say, you know what? Actually, we're getting into the documents, because down the line, in which Adam Schiff has made this point several times, Pete, down the line, at some point, those tables are going to turn, and you're going to have a president who's not of your party, and you're going to ask some questions and want to see some documents. And then what? Is that the time you no longer speak against the family? Or are you going to remember this moment when you could have said, let us see the documents. If you've truly done nothing wrong and an acquittal is the outcome, then what do you have to hide? What do you have to lose?
I'm not sure that kind of precedent matters much anymore. They just destroy it and over and again. But what about when is Laura, the big vote on witnesses? Isn't that the big question? Will at least 4 Republican senators vote to hear from witnesses? And the names we hear the most that we would really love to hear from would be John Bolton, President's former national security advisor, his chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, and his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. I'm sure there are countless of other ones, but I feel like those are 3 of the names that we hear. When is that vote going to happen?
$1 million question, but likely going to be between next Wednesday and Friday. Right now, the defense team is slated to go this coming Saturday after having heard 3 8-hour days, presumably from the House impeachment managers. They'll begin their case. They are not in session on Sundays, but they do go on Saturdays. So it'll go Saturday to Monday and into Tuesday. They're entitled to all 3 of those days. Now, whether they take all that time is a different question, but that's going to largely determine when that 16-hour period of questioning begins, presumably over a 2-day period. So looking between Wednesday and Friday. Now, what are the 2 key dates to watch for people looking ahead? Well, one, perhaps, is if you're a football fan, is the Super Bowl, but that's not their concern. The other issue is the State of the Union. And by all accounts, Mitch McConnell is trying to expedite this because he wants the president, by the time he takes that pulpit in the State of the Union on, I think, February 4th, to be able to say that he is an exonerated president. Now, remember, when Bill Clinton gave his State of the Union speech, it was in the middle of an impeachment trial, and he did not have that luxury. Very different presidents, very different styles, very different approaches to being apologetic. One was not. But now you've got this sort of looming deadline in the future of, can we get this wrapped up if you're Mitch McConnell before the actual State of the Union.
Well, you mentioned the Republicans might not take up the entire time they're allotted for the defense. And it's interesting because, number one, they don't really have a defense. And number two, they're going to want to expedite this for the reasons you just gave in terms of the schedule. But are what we expect, I mean, so that gives them incentive to go shorter, both those reasons in my thinking. But more importantly, what are we going to see from them? What kind of a defense are we going to be seeing from them? And structurally, procedurally, when we hear from the president's lawyers while the House managers make their case, what is that? Will Democrats get a similar chance to argue against the case being made next week by the president's lawyers?
Well, first of all, it's hard to imagine that the president's defense team is going to be able to make the sort of focused, coherent storyline that the House impeachment managers have done by virtue of the fact that their approach is totally different. See, the House managers are laying out a factual chronology of why 3 days in July matter, why Mueller's testimony on July 24th, the call with President Zelensky on July 25th, and then the Gordon Sondland, David Holmes restaurant discussion in Kiev with the president, following up on the fact that Zelensky would do anything for you and he quote unquote loves your ass. Why those 3 days matter and how they form a bigger picture about the ways in which aid was withheld and the cover up unfolded. And in contrast, the defense team for Trump has largely been saying, well, hold on a second. First of all, that was never his motivation. His motivation was always about trying to root out corruption. And it was all about Hunter and Joe Biden. And you haven't made your case. We haven't given you a chance to make your case because you don't have to give you the documents. We haven't made your case. And he was trying to root out corruption, and you can't prove otherwise. You can't do so. We won't give you the tools with different documents to prove otherwise, but that's the point. Number two, their argument is going to be that even if, which of course, if you as a defense attorney are in the position to say, even if you're behind the eight ball, right. Even if it's an abuse of power, even if I killed this person, even if I stabbed the person violently, even if I was speeding or drunk driving, officer, whatever follows next is going to be a little bit of a concession that you have actually engaged in that behavior. So their defense will now be after the corruption didn't occur, was even if it was an abuse of power, that's not an impeachable offense. That's not enough to do so. And I joke about that, but really what they're getting at, and not in a very eloquent way as of yet, what I suspect they're getting at, Pete, is to say, look, we're not going to give carte blanche to Congress to decide whenever they want that an abuse of power has occurred, and then they can impeach and remove a president. Right. It would essentially be an umbrella and vague term, and we won't be able to know for future presidents, let alone this one, when you're doing the wrong thing and when you're not. And you've got to think of impeachment as a tool of deterrence. If you don't make clear why this is any different than what other concessions or negotiations are being made with foreign countries by our diplomats in different contexts, if you don't make clear why this is so different, so egregious, then it won't have a deterrent effect. It will just be you running around Congress saying, well, I don't like the way he looked at me. Let's impeach. But it was an abuse of power.
But just to be clear, the reason why it's so different is because Congress passed almost $400 million in military aid for Ukraine, our friend, our ally in the fight against Russia. And the president of the United States prevented that aid from getting there unless the leaders of Ukraine, the president of Ukraine, made an announcement, investigated his domestic political opponent. I mean, this kind of scheme, this scandal is very unique. It's very original, and it's completely unprecedented, right? So it's not like anybody could make that future case unless a future president intervened and stopped congressionally approved aid from going to a country unless they investigated his domestic political opponent. It's very original.
And that's what Pelosi has said changed the tides for her about making the decision to seek articles of impeachment. Because, yes, it is true. We, in our interaction as a country with foreign countries and foreign diplomats, we do negotiate and make deals, but we are doing so, presumably, on behalf of the interests of the nation, not on behalf of the interests of one reelection campaign. And when the president of the United States, according to the documents and the arguments about the House impeachment managers are making, when Donald Trump decided to withhold that aid, that wasn't his to begin with. It wasn't in his political, it wasn't in his account. It wasn't his personal account. He converted taxpayer dollars into campaign donations to help his reelection campaign and used it as leverage to say, I don't know if you like me or not, voters. I don't know if you are on my team or not, Republican, Democrat, whatever you might be. But guess what? Those taxpayer dollars, that 400 plus million, I'm going to now use as a kind of campaign donation and use leverage to get an in-kind benefit. What is that? Dirt on Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. And that is why this is so different. Yes, of course, you remember Nixon wanted to use the IRS to try to look at his opponents and rivals and people he disliked. This is different in a lot of respects from obviously Watergate. Yeah. But one fundamental way is, of course, it's a foreign government you're asking. And there's one thing that's very clear. You do not and cannot solicit any interference or aid from a foreign government in a U.S. election. But of course, past is prologue, isn't it, Pete? Didn't we hear this on July 24th from Mueller about Russia?
That's the most important question. The president has also made it clear to George Stephanopoulos and has said before he would be fine with anybody, a foreign country, offering him information. All right, Laura, I know you got to run back in there, but last question, if you got time, which is all we are going to hear from Republicans when they get their shot at it? Are they just going to be trying to muddy the waters about Joe Biden? And what, if anything, it matters about Joe Biden and his son and Ukraine?
So we want to be careful when we say the Republicans. We have to be clear that it's the Trump's defense team who is on behalf of President Trump, who happens to be, they say he's a Republican. He says he's a Republican. There you go. There's that. So what they probably will hear, there will be some muddying of the waters, but mostly deflection. If you notice what happened before even the opening statements began, when there was the discussion and debate about the resolution, about how long to have the trial, what the trial rules were going to be, the focus was on Adam Schiff. The focus was on Jerry Nadler. The focus was on camels, anything that wasn't about the underlying charges being made, because the more people are talking about things like Nadler using the words cover up, the more people are talking about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, the less you're thinking about the president's accountability or culpability. So that's going to be the strategy of it all. Joe Biden has already made clear, as has Chuck Schumer and Adam Schiff, that they're not going to have a fantasy football league sort of atmosphere where if you give us this witness, we'll give you Hunter Biden and or Joe Biden.
That's not going to happen.
No, but what they will potentially do, the big question is, will the defense team put on an affirmative case? Affirmative case meaning I'm going to now prove why this person's innocent. Now, that would be odd because it opens them up to a whole lot of questions and shows Achilles' heels, and it may even create a circus environment of who they're going to call. Are they going to call Giuliani? Probably not. They're going to call Trump? Probably not. They're going to call. Who are they going to call? Won't be the Ghostbusters in this. So it's all a question of how they're going to present the evidence. Will it be simply reacting to and trying to poke holes in what is insufficient? Or will it be, all right, now you've had your shot, now let us prove it. Now, my instinct is telling me, it's a rule we used to have as a prosecutor all the time. When you've made your point, sit down. Don't take all the time that you have. If you have 3 hours, you don't take it because it makes it seem to the jury that you feel like every single one of those points was so important to actually combat that you have to. You're almost, it turns into, methinks the lady doth protest too much. And so they may take a page out of a prosecutor's handbook and on a cross-examination or a redirect, and say, you know what, this is foolishness. You haven't proved a single thing. There's no connection to the president of the United States. You can pound the table all you want, but here's what you haven't proven, and ignoring the fact that the reason you can't prove particular aspects is because, to quote Donald Trump himself in Davos, We have all the material. They don't.
Exactly. Do you see any, is there a wide disagreement against legal analysts and constitutional scholars as to whether or not the president committed a impeachable offense here? Because it seems like even Jonathan Turley, who defended him in the House, has said otherwise.
Well, it's pretty clear on a couple things. One in particular, the most blaring, is that the president need not commit a actual crime in the sense of here is the corresponding criminal code section and statute that he has committed a crime. We allow for high crimes and misdemeanors to be more of a term of art. And as Jerry Nadler and the House impeachment manager talked about, they're looking for the ABCs, and that is what people agree with. The ABCs of impeachment, meaning abuse of power, betrayal of national interest, and corruption of office and or the elections. And so on those 3 points about what is required or contemplated by the founding fathers, people are in wide agreement. Whether this is the kind of thing that should rise to the level of removal, the disagreement really comes to this. When people are disagreeing, the constitutional scholars and otherwise, it's about the idea of what the precedent will be, knowing that the president does need to have some great latitude in foreign diplomacy. What will be the precedent set, and how could future presidents either be guided by, deterred, or simply just ignore this precedent? So I think the scholars are trying to wrestle with what will happen next. But surely there is one thing, if I can just, and here's you, one thing that's really clear, Pete, is this. The rules that are set out right now and what you're seeing in this trial does not bode well for a future president that may find themselves impeached. And here's why. Right now, we've got verdict first, trial later, allowing 3 days, 24 hours worth of the House impeachment managers to say anything that they like grounded in reality. And then for your team to be able to try to rebut any aspect of that. And then you'll decide about witnesses. That works perhaps for Trump only because he is sure that he'll have an acquittal. But what about when the numbers and the odds are not ever in his favor?
Great point.
What about for that future president who says, well, I don't know. There may be a real case and controversy here. It's not a automatic victory. Now I'm tied to the precedent of Trump, where you get to speak for 24 hours and tell the American public all the things that I have supposedly done wrong with slides and demonstratives. And I have to try to rebut that after the cat or the toothpaste is out of the tube.
Now we're all tied to Trump's precedent. Thank you, Laura. I asked you for 10 minutes and I took 20. I'm a greedy, selfish person. You've been working all day. Thank you for doing the podcast. Let's have a much longer talk in person soon. Go try to find some rest or some peace. I don't know. You must be going crazy.
Do you mean chocolate? Because that's where I'm going.
You're the greatest.
That's where I will go.
You deserve all of the chocolate in the world, Laura Coates. Thank you so much. You're the best. All right, bye. There you go, Laura Coates. Listen to her on Urban View, SiriusXM. That's channel 126, daily, 10 to noon. She does an awesome show there. You can see her on CNN every day where she does expert legal analysis, and hopefully I'll see her in person soon. We'll sit down and have a really long conversation about her life and about her thoughts and about everything. She's just, she's awesome. Follow her on Twitter right now. It's really helpful when you reach out to people who are on the show and say, yeah, I heard you on the podcast. The Laura Coates. Coates with an E. Okay, now to my one of my longest, oldest, bestest friends, one of your all-time favorite guests on the old SiriusXM show. Professor Eric Segall joined me from his office at Georgia State University, where he is a constitutional law professor. He is also the author of 2 very good books, Supreme Myths, Why the Court is Not a Court, the Justices Are Not Judges, and most recently, Originalism as Faith. Both books are awesome. You should buy them. You should follow him on Twitter, where he's very active, at @eSpinSegall. And we had a really interesting conversation. He's always provocative. He has unique, original ideas about everything. He doesn't subscribe to or succumb to groupthink. And he's taught me how not to, even though I still really often do. I'm the optimist in this conversation. He's the realist in this conversation. I'm almost always wrong. He's almost always right. Here's my conversation with the brilliant, the beautiful Eric Segall, the Legal Eagle. All right, let's talk impeachment with none other than the legal eagle, constitutional law professor, author of Originalism as Faith and Supreme Myths, Professor Eric Segall, who is on Twitter at eSpinSegall. He is in his office at Georgia State University. What floor are you on? Because we're FaceTiming, and I feel like you're on a high floor in your office. I didn't realize that.
I'm only on the third floor, number 3.
Oh, all right.
I'm not sure we want to tell the world that, because I may say some things over the next few minutes that could get a lot of people really angry, but all right.
All right. I don't know what you're talking about, but now I'm afraid.
Me too. Mostly liberals and progressives. I'm afraid of liberals and progressives. How do you feel about that?
Okay, go ahead. Well, what's your unpopular view with liberals and progressives? You're a very liberal guy. What's the deal?
So my premise, first of all, a little bit non-legal. My premise is that law and politics can be at times a lot like poker. And what I mean by that is good poker players know that if you're dealt a bad hand, you're dealt a bad hand. And you have to make the best of a bad hand, which often is very challenging. And sometimes law and politics is like that. All right. There is virtually no chance of President Trump being impeached. We all know that. I mean, when I say no chance, of course, there's always a chance of anything. But if one is gambling, there is virtually no chance of President Trump being convicted. So everything the Democrats are doing now should be about one thing and one thing only. How will this affect the election of 2020? There is no other consideration that should be relevant other than integrity. I'm fine with people having integrity and wanting to do the right thing. But as far as strategy goes, there's no review of this. There's no Supreme Court, decision. There's nothing. It is this and then the election, and they're not going to win this. So the only thing that should be relevant is the election. Now, I just saw that Schiff just talked today for like 2.5 hours straight or something. And yesterday I watched almost all day, and it was unbelievably hard for me, a law professor who had to teach this stuff in the future, to sit through it all. I don't think the Democrats understand what good advocacy is, and apparently there are a lot of people on Twitter who don't understand what good advocacy is.
Good advocacy? Hold on. I didn't have you on for your political analysis, but that's all you're giving me is your political analysis. I'm happy. Why is there no legal analysis? That's all we're getting is legal analysis.
This is all politics. There's no legal stuff here.
Impeachment is something that you teach in constitutional law class at your university.
No, we don't. We will in the future now. We haven't before.
Why not?
Because it's not. Well, okay. That's an interesting question. Most law professors teach constitutional law from the perspective of Supreme Court decisions. The only Supreme Court decision about impeachment is we're not going to get involved in impeachments. So I teach that case. But all that case says is the courts aren't going to get involved in impeachments. So it's not the kind of, you don't have a case.
So constitutional law is all about Supreme Court decisions.
Well, no, not necessarily, but the way most people teach it.
Well, constitutional law, does it not take into consideration the legislative branch and its responsibilities?
Sure. Of course it does.
So why does it not? Why don't you have a whole course on impeachment? Sounds fun.
There hasn't been impeachment of whom? I mean, there's only been less than 20 impeachments in history. Only 3 times the president has been impeached. We're getting into an area I don't necessarily want to get into. My point about there being no law here is the Senate gets to do whatever it wants to do with 51 votes, except for 3 things. The Constitution's very clear. The senators have to take an oath. They've done that. The Chief Justice has to preside. He's doing that. And it takes 2/3 to convict, and that's never going to happen here. So that's where law runs out, Pete, and everything else is politics. I refuse. You've known me too long to hide this fact from anybody. There is no law. This is not about law. It's about politics.
Okay, so you're going to give me a political analysis then. That's the only thing to discuss. And your political analysis is basically this entire impeachment should be considered and only looked at through the lens of how it will affect the 2020 election.
From the Democrat perspective, yes. Yes.
Okay, well, let's just push back and game out the very slim possibility that somehow 4 Republican senators will vote
but that was my point about poker. when you get a really bad hand in poker, you can fold or you can bluff. But what really good players know, Pete, is if you end up after the last card is turned over and you can't win, your hand is so bad that you almost certainly can't win, you either have to bluff or fold. I'm not saying there can't be a conviction, but no one should be planning strategy around the possibility of a conviction because the odds against it are infinitesimal. So why? What are the Democrats trying to do here? Are they trying to impeach the president? No, because they can't.
The political result, I'm going to argue, would have a similar effect on the election. Arguably, if they threw him out of office, it would make it even harder for the Democratic nominee to win because
I disagree. If the Republicans, it depends who they ran, but if they ran Pence, no, it'd be much easier for the Democrats to win. There's no question. Because you'd have Republicans voting to oust a Republican president whose vice president is ensnared in virtually all of the same stuff.
Okay. So basically, do you think that they are not making or don't have a good case, the Democrats?
No, I think he clearly should be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors.
Okay.
But that doesn't matter what I think.
Right. It matters what the Republicans in the Senate think.
No, it doesn't.
What are you saying?
That's what I'm trying to tell you. That's what I'm trying to say. This is why this is controversial. It only matters what swing voters in 5 states think.
Oh, okay.
Nothing else matters.
And what is your analysis on what swing voters in 5 states think?
I don't know what they think, but I know what they can tolerate. And this is what I was going to start with earlier. There are some elementary principles of advocacy that lawyers are taught because, after all, at the end of the day, what litigators do is we advocate for positions, for clients, for sides. And one of the best summaries of how to be a good advocate I've ever heard came from one of the smartest lawyers I've ever known, who said, everything you do has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you should say it in as few words as possible. Say what you mean in as few words as possible with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And now maybe the exception to that is no one's watching the impeachment, so that there's only going to be clips on YouTube and CNN and Fox, and maybe you play to get those clips on. I'm not sophisticated enough to understand that. But here's what I think would have been a more effective strategy, Pete, for the Democrats to stand up and say, this is not complicated, this is not hard, this is not complex. The president clearly said to Ukraine, I will only release the aid if you do me a favor. That was the import of everything. We have his own transcript to prove that. And by the way, it's a redacted transcript, so he probably has the most incriminating stuff left out. Using American foreign policy to pursue a political opponent domestically is a misdemeanor under the terms of the impeachment clause, and he should be impeached. And I would have included as a third article his working with the Russians, but they didn't do that. But none of that's the point. The point is days and days of speeches are not going to be effective. They're not.
Well, how could they have done it differently if not days and days of speeches?
It takes 1 hour to summarize the case against Donald Trump. It takes 1 hour. And so yesterday the strategy was make all these motions. You know, it all would last 12 hours, whatever it lasted for. Nobody watched it, obviously. No one on the East Coast watched it after 9 or 10 or 11 o'clock. And all of that procedural stuff we knew was going to lose. The vote, we knew it was going to be 53-47, and it was. So again, what's the point of all of that? And I don't see the connection between those procedural motions and swing voters in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, Colorado, Michigan, Minnesota. I don't see that connection. And I actually would have been very explicit and said something to the effect of, we live in a country that, I would have said this on the floor, we live in a polarized country. And that goes for both sides. But there are still people in the middle. We're talking to you.
You would have just straight up said, we're talking to the people in the middle. I mean, yes. I don't even know if that's... there are people in the middle. Really, you think there are people that don't either hate or support Donald Trump? You think they're somehow on the fence? You think those people exist, and you think those people are a critical mass that could actually affect the outcome of an election in one of these 5 states?
How do you explain the fact, now we're not conjecturing here, it's a fact, that some people voted for both Obama and Trump.
Well, there's a lot of analysis of that, but I don't think. But that doesn't implicate.
If you voted for Obama in 2012 and Trump in 2016, you're gettable.
You're gettable.
Yes.
I disagree. I think that if you voted for Donald Trump in 2016, either you have lost your support for him or you stay the same. Nobody has decided that did not vote for Donald Trump. Nobody that did not vote for Donald Trump has said, you know what, I did not vote for him, but he's really won me over.
Here's where here's an example of how, well, first of all, we know people voted for both Obama and Trump. So that's a conundrum right there that we can talk about some other time. Here's a hypo for you, Pete. We're getting off impeachment, but this is actually more interesting. So the Supreme Court has a big abortion case coming up, and I think they're going to do a lot of damage to Roe versus Wade and the Casey decision. I don't think they're going to say we overturn those cases, but I think they're going to do a lot of damage. But if they were to either overturn them explicitly, the states can now prohibit abortion, or they issued an opinion that really devastated those cases in a way where even not that smart people, not that smart, understood that states could now prohibit most abortions, I think Trump would easily lose, without a doubt.
Okay, so now you've shifted gears and you're saying that the outcome of the Supreme Court's decision on abortion is something that's going to have great effect on the election in November 2020. Is that what I heard you say?
Well, yeah, but I'm saying that as a defense to what I said earlier, which is there are people who don't yet know who they're going to vote for.
Okay. Do you think that it is possible that, given the way that these hearings are playing out, that people are watching them and learning things that they didn't learn from their partisan media sources?
No, and I just 2 minutes before we started this podcast, 2 minutes, I looked and saw that twice as many people watched it on Fox as watched it on CNN and MSNBC combined.
That's huge. That means they're getting them more on. Why?
No, I watched it on Fox.
Yes, but it doesn't matter. Fox has the same feed as the other.
No, it doesn't. Did you see what Fox was doing last night? They had when the Democrats were talking for a good part of the evening, they had half of the screen silent, and they had Tucker Carlson. I couldn't watch Hannity, of course, talking over it and giving his take on things.
Okay, well, I turned on Fox earlier, and they had
that was at nighttime. That was starting around 8 o'clock.
Well, for their primetime programming. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I just saw a tweet, which I thought was fascinating, and now I can't find it. Overheard on the House floor or on the Senate floor. Republican senators basically finding out for the first time any number of details because they are so in their own silos, in their own partisan media silo. They don't even know much of what the president has been accused of, and they certainly didn't pay much attention, apparently, to the House impeachment hearings. And so one analysis is that Republicans, both viewers and Trump supporters and in the Senate, are learning for the first time many of the specific details that that President Trump is being accused of, number one. Number two, the fact that they are not allowing these witnesses and documents to be heard will potentially do a tremendous amount of damage, Eric, because that stuff will very well probably come out between now and the election and will damage them even further. And they're considering all of that, the things they're learning now and the things that are going to come out, including in John Bolton's book. And when we hear from those witnesses and when that stuff leaks, if those documents get out, that could potentially be a game changer. Now, you know me, I'm an optimist, and so I'm just making this stuff up, and you are a realist.
I have a few reactions to that. First, you are the guy who said Trump would never get the nomination, would never get the win, and so on. I kept telling you, yes, he could.
Why do you have to bring? Why? Why?
But leaving that aside,
I mean, Jesus, do you? I mean, I can imagine your card that you play with your wife. You're the lady who wants. Just
I would never do that with my wife. You know my wife.
I mean, you just sweep the leg on me.
Okay. Now, as I also. Trump said this morning, we have all the materials. That's why we're winning. That's why, he said something new this morning.
I sent that to you.
So Yes, you did. You get credit for that.
And what does that mean? What does that mean? When the president said from Davos, we've got all the material and they don't. What does that mean? Because a lot of people are saying that he's admitting that they have all of this evidence and that can never be seen.
Okay, the question, what does that mean when referring to anything Donald Trump says, is a silly, ridiculous question, because no one knows what that is. Let me just go on. Everything you said earlier would make sense in a world where there was a reasonable chance that Donald Trump could be impeached. There's virtually no chance he'll be impeached. You know this, Pete. So I'm going back to my original point here. If we start from the premise that maybe he'll be impeached, the Democrats are doing a great job. I have no complaints. I'm not an expert. I wouldn't suggest how they should do it. But if you start from the premise that the goal here is Michigan, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Ohio, Florida, a couple other states, then I think they're doing it all wrong. I think it's a huge risk. Pete, it doesn't take 8 hours to make the following point. John Bolton knows what happened during that time period. He quit right afterwards. During it. He knows what happened. We should hear from him. The Democrats want to hear from him. The Republicans don't. Why don't the Republicans want to hear from John Bolton? There is no good reason for that. They're not responsible senators. It's not a responsible political party, and we're done now. And that can be said in 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be said in 8 hours. I think the video clips are effective. I do. I think Democrats have done a good job.
Yes, I think they're doing it like a radio show.
Except they're lost between Pete. Okay, so I've taught constitutional law for 28 years, and I've studied the art of teaching. The very worst way to communicate ideas is through lecture. It is the worst way. And the longer you lecture, the worse it gets. They had no choice here. Why?
What is that? Then what's the difference? Then how come Hannity is so good? Is he not lecturing on his radio show?
He's not good. Why do you think Hannity's good?
He's the most influential political person in all of media. And all he does is he lectures every day for 3 hours. All of right-wing media is a lecture.
Sorry, I've watched a lot of Hannity. Plus, he's from Georgia. I've listened to him on the radio a lot.
Yeah, he
doesn't.
What is it?
He lectures for... Well, hold on. Yeah. He lectures for 5 or 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. Then he brings a guest on. Then he rants for 5 minutes. Then he brings a couple guests on. Then he lectures for 5 or 10 minutes. And then he brings a couple guests on. Now, wait. The Democrats didn't have that option because they're not being allowed to call witnesses. So one of their options was being taken away from them. That being the case, their only alternative, if they can't get witnesses, is to make their point strongly, comprehensively, and quickly. And doing it over 10 hours is not the way to do that. It's just not. Here's
that tweet. Overheard conversation. This is Joe Lockhart. Who is he? The former press secretary for Clinton, I think. Overheard conversation.
You mean when we had press secretaries?
Oh, yeah. Overheard conversation between 2 Republican senators who only watch Fox News. Is this stuff real? I've only heard any of this stuff. I haven't heard any of this stuff before. I thought it was all about a server. If half the stuff Schiff is saying is true, we're up Schitt's Creek. I hope the White House has exculpatory evidence.
Pete, Republican senators who are running for re-election sometime in the next 6 years, they're not going to vote against impeachment because they think Trump didn't do all this stuff. They know he did. They're going to vote against impeachment because they want to be reelected. Right. Michael Steele told me, among other people, that strike that comment. I am told by 2 people who work, not Michael Steele, on Capitol Hill, who work in the Senate, that were it a secret vote, there'd be 90 votes to impeach.
I've heard that. Yeah. They all want to throw Trump down the well, but they know they'd be thrown down the well right after him. Yeah, exactly. I get that. But,
which is why this is about the election, not impeachment.
Okay, so if it's about the election, then why not talk about those, 4 or 5 senators that are up for re-election in this upcoming election that are in a tough spot because they're in more purple states? You're Susan Collins, you're Cory Gardner, and who are the other ones?
Well, that isn't. So
and therefore they could vote to which we haven't seen yet, in a game-changing moment to hear from witnesses. And if we heard from the witnesses, do you think if we heard from witnesses, anything would change in terms of your political analysis so far? If you heard from Bolton, Mulvaney, and Pompeo, and
Who's the fourth person that people talk about?
If any one of those people testified under oath that this was always about a quid pro quo, we were never going to release the aid until they announced the Biden investigation, and then the whistleblower happened, so Trump had no choice. Had the whistleblower not happened, Ukraine would not have gotten the aid absent that kind of announcement. If any one of them said that, I think that could conceivably change things, but I'm not sure. I don't think if Bolton says that, it changes anything. The other two, maybe, because the other two are still associated with Trump, right?
I mean,
Bolton
Mulvaney already did say that, by the way, right?
Yes. And you see what difference it made.
Right.
None.
It doesn't matter. It only matters what Trump says.
So Pete, I've watched and seen many trials where the lawyer for one side stands up and says, this is not a complicated case. There are many complicated cases. Yeah. In fact, this is a standard trope for defense attorneys in cases. You know, the O.J. Simpson case lasted 4 months, 6 months, 8 months, whatever it was. There was all kinds of evidence. Prosecutors in easy cases say, this is not that kind of case. I have this gun. I have that person. I have that place. I'm going to show it to you in 3 hours. You'll be out of here tomorrow. It's an incredibly effective technique. And if I am the person in Ohio or Michigan or Florida who voted for Obama and also voted for Trump, and there are thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people like that. There are certainly tens of thousands. There are definitely tens of thousands. Look at the numbers. We can prove it. If I am that person and I'm told you must listen to 3 days, 10 hours a day of motions and procedures and this, but if I'm told I can explain this to you in 2 hours, here we go, I'm listening.
Well, yeah, but okay. People have different interpretations of what the president is being accused of doing. And we can't know exactly what their interpretations are, and we can't know exactly how much they're paying attention. But your whole analysis here is about a way to communicate that would be more effective, that would be more succinct, and that would have a different outcome than the way that they are communicating. But what do you think people's general understanding of what happened is? Because that is really what your opinion is hinging on. It'd be even before the House impeached the president, before the Senate hearings, these voters that you're talking about, these crucial voters, these swing voters, these 5 states of voters, they had some idea. I mean, the president admitted to a lot of these things on his own. So what do you think it was before the House impeachment hearing?
Well, let's back up a minute. It's a good question. I'll answer it, but let's back up just 1 minute. The question is, what are we trying to accomplish? We, meaning the Democrats in the impeachment hearings. What are the Democrats trying to accomplish? If we start from the premise that no one's ever going to change their mind anyway, then there's no point to any of this because he's not going to be impeached. So that's a non-starter. That's
not a terrible premise to start from. Everybody thinks maybe folks are frozen in their opinions.
Maybe not. It doesn't change the fact that there are people who voted for both Obama and Trump, and we got to figure out why. So that fact has to be explained somehow. I'm going to assume, Pete, and if I'm wrong, then I take back everything. I'm going to assume there are people who really detest Donald Trump and voted for him anyway. And I think that's true because I know people like that. My wife's relatives who are evangelicals, they didn't like Trump, but they voted for him for all kinds of reasons. I don't think it would take a lot for some of those reasons to go away. So one of the ways those reasons would go away is if abortion is back to the states. There's a lot of people who voted for Trump because of abortion. Now, if there are people who think, well, Trump, Ukraine, quid pro quo, I don't really care, but I'll listen to an hour and see what I hear. And if I hear something terrible, maybe it will change my mind. Then that's, I think, has to be the strategy. And that's not what's happening in the Senate right now. That way of saying it's not hard. The Democrats are making this sound complicated when it's not complicated.
I don't think they are making it sound complicated. It's not my interpretation.
3-hour opening statement? Schifter spent 3 hours on an opening. It can be done in 30 minutes.
I heard him. I thought it was great what he was saying. I thought it made sense what he was saying.
It's your job to hear him. It's your job to listen.
I hear what you're saying. Okay, so let's just walk all the way back and wrap this up by asking you to explain what the president did wrong and why it is so egregious.
when it comes to Ukraine, I think the president's done a lot of egregiously terrible.
Right. Exactly. Let's stick within what he's being impeached for and not go into all the other horrific things he does every day.
So I'm going to first concede something that needs to be conceded, that obviously politics comes into play in foreign policy, on a continual basis. When American presidents formulate their vision of foreign policy, let's say towards Israel, for example, how that affects their electoral chances if they're in the first is definitely something that presidents do. I'm making the case first that obviously partisan interests come into play sometimes in foreign policy decisions, and presidents shouldn't be impeached for that. Obama was known as a president not particularly hospitable to Israel compared to other presidents. Maybe he sincerely believed that, or maybe he thought that was in his electoral interests. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But that's not what Trump's doing here. Okay, that's that general, this will affect my voting, who votes for me kind of Cuba, mentality is fine.
Israel,
Cuba, exactly. Russia, all the same stuff. That's different than Congress, not the president, allocating money under law that has to be given unless certain conditions are, met or not met, and a president messing with that aid in a way to advance only his personal political interests at the expense of one other person's political fortunes.
The former vice president and long-serving senator.
Well, no, more importantly, his opponent in the election.
Well, potentially, yeah, but an American. I mean,
but I think the fact that he's his opponent, he didn't ask him to go after Segall or Dominic. Neither of us. He asked him to go after, or even Chuck Schumer.
But it would be equally bad. It would be not equally. Yes, he wanted to damage his domestic political opponent, but it matters that guy used to be the vice president.
Now we're talking a little bit about law, which I'm back to my expertise. The difference, for the first time in this conversation, the difference is holding up aid that under law has to go, as opposed to, for example, Obama sitting around with his advisors and saying, well, Israel's a tough call. I feel certain ways. I think we'll get more votes if my general approach is this, and it's my discretion. This wasn't his discretion. Right. This was Congress's decision, which he had to implement.
So the fact that he upheld money that Congress had approved of required is where you see the abuse of power. And for the reasons he did it is where you see the abuse of power.
But I have to say that I think the Democrats made a mistake. In the 10 hours they spent today trying to prove quid pro quo and obstruction of justice in his not giving up conversations in the hearing, they could have used that time, Pete, to make a general abuse of office case against Trump and just repeated his worst tweets over and over again. And that could have affected people in Michigan.
His tweets regarding this?
Everything. Whatever. His insulting, hostile, unpresidential, abusive power tweets. When witnesses were testifying in Congress...
But that's not what the House impeached him for.
No, but they should have. That's my point. When he was literally threatening witnesses who were testifying in front of Congress on Twitter, that's an abuse of office. And if you're going to go 10 hours, then throw in the kitchen sink. If you're going to go 1 hour, then be specific and to the point. And they picked the worst scenario. They're going 10 hours on a 1 hour thing. But there are people I think that the people the progressives and the liberals who are mad at me for this, who are saying Schiff's doing an amazing job and Dem's doing an amazing job, I think they are in many ways not seeing this opportunity clearly. The opportunity here is to affect the election 8 months, whatever it is, 10 months before the election. It is not to impeach a president. He's not going to be impeached. He's not going to be impeached.
Okay. All right. There it is. Eric Segall. Please let him know what you think on Twitter at @eSpinSegall. Let me know what you think as well. I really appreciate that analysis. It's always original. It's always intelligent. And I hope you're wrong. Okay, that is it. That ended without him saying goodbye because I think I cut him off there. We kept talking or something. I don't know what happened, but he did say goodbye. Sorry for the awkward ending and interruption here on the podcast. And a reminder now to sign up on Patreon. Could not sustain the podcast without you there. Thank you so much for your paid subscriptions. Patreon, patreon.com/PDominic, where I'm going to be having a live conversation with all the Patreon subscribers and talking about what we can do to make the show bigger and better, what you like, what you don't like, ideas, creative ideas. Everybody on Patreon is a producer, so sign up over there and be a part of the future of the creation of the betterment of this podcast. I want to hear from you. Also, I'll be at the comic strip this weekend, and I'll be headlining, that's in New York City, headlining Levity Live in Nyack, New York on February 6th. Lots more dates, but give the podcast a review and a rating, and I will talk to you on Monday for episode 39. Thank you.